The Gray Sweater and the Golden Mind. The courtroom buzzed with quiet laughter, but it wasn't a happy kind. It was the kind that made your skin crawl, the kind meant to humiliate. "Are you seriously representing yourself?" A sharply dressed attorney scoffed, his voice full of mockery. All eyes turned to the woman standing at the defendant's table. She wore a plain gray sweater, black slacks, and shoes that had seen better days. Her hair was tied back neatly, her face calm but unreadable. No makeup, no flash, no designer handbag. Just a simple leather binder clutched in both hands like it held the world. Her name was Emily Grace Donovan, and to most in the courtroom, she looked like an easy win, a nobody. But they didn't know who she used to be. And they had no idea what was about to happen. The morning had started quietly in the heart of Old Oakland, a historic, low-income neighborhood in Savannah, Georgia. Emily stood by the small, cracked window of her kitchen, sipping tea. Sunlight streaked across the wooden floor of her grandmother's house, a place filled with memories and legacy. The walls needed paint. The pipes rattled when the water ran. But to her, it was more than a home. It was history. She glanced at the letter again, the one she had received months ago from Brightline Holdings, a powerful real estate developer. They wanted to buy out every house on her block to build high-rise condos. Progress, they called it. To Emily, it felt more like erasure. Most of her neighbors had already accepted the checks. Some had cried as they signed away their homes. Others had simply folded, thinking they had no choice. But not Emily. Because she knew the law. Years ago, she had walked the halls of one of Atlanta's top firms, Harper and Reeves. She was once their youngest associate. She had delivered arguments that made grown men stutter. But after a crisis of conscience and a betrayal that cut deep, she walked away from that world. And now, she was back in court. But this time, not in heels and a tailored suit. This time, she came as a woman defending her home, her history, and her people. As Emily boarded the bus to the courthouse, she noticed the city had changed. Skyscrapers were replacing the old brick buildings she'd grown up around. Fancy coffee shops now stood where once there were corner stores and bookstores. Gentrification. That word rang louder than ever. At the Savannah Municipal Courthouse, Emily climbed the steps alone. The other side, Brightline Holdings, had arrived in style. 5 lawyers in tailored suits, clipboards, digital tablets. Their client, Mr. Langford, CEO of Brightline, stood in the hallway chatting with reporters as if this was a press conference. She heard someone whisper, "Is that the woman representing herself? This is gonna be fast." But Emily just walked on, quiet, unshaken. Inside courtroom 5B, Judge Theodore Banks, a man known for his gruff tone and dislike for delays, adjusted his glasses as he reviewed the docket. Brightline Holdings versus Donovan, Emily G., for property acquisition and development. Thomas Drew, the lead attorney for Brightline, stood confidently. "Your Honor," he began, "this is a routine matter. We've offered fair market value. The defendant is the last holdout. This case need not waste your time." Judge Banks looked over his glasses. "And the defendant is representing herself." Emily rose, straightened her shoulders, and said, "Yes, Your Honor." Emily Grace Donovan, former associate at Harper and Reeves, Emory Law School graduate, first in class. A few heads turned. Judge Banks raised an eyebrow. So, not entirely unqualified. Drew looked annoyed. "With all due respect, Your Honor, her legal past is irrelevant. She's been out of practice for nearly 6 years." Emily opened her binder calmly. "With respect, Mr. Drew, that doesn't mean I'd forgotten how to read a law book." Judge Banks grunted. "Let's proceed." Emily began with what no one expected, a story. "Your Honor, this house was built in 1898. It belonged to my great-grandmother, Lillian Grace Donovan, who was one of Savannah's first black midwives. During segregation, she delivered over 300 babies in our neighborhood, when hospitals wouldn't let black women inside. Her home became a safe space for expecting mothers, activists, and educators. Thomas Drew interrupted. This is emotional storytelling, not legal substance. Emily didn't flinch. She pulled out a document. Exhibit A, certified copy of Lillian Donovan's midwifery license, issued in 1921. Exhibit B, testimonials from living community members who were born in that house. She continued, voice strong, eyes locked with the judge. Under Georgia Preservation Statute 43B, any property with substantial, documented cultural significance must be given consideration for preservation, especially if it impacts communities of color. Thomas Drew smirked. That statute has never been successfully used in court, Your Honor. Emily smiled back. Until today. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Reporters had started taking notes. But she wasn't done. Exhibit C, she said, holding up a photo. This is my grandmother hosting a voter registration drive in 1965. This house wasn't just a residence. It was a civil rights hub, a community meeting place, a landmark of struggle and triumph. Thomas Drew stood again, flustered. Your Honor, this is a development matter. The City Council has already signed off. We followed proper channels. This statute has no teeth. Emily didn't argue. She turned directly to Judge Banks. Your Honor, I submit to the court a formal request for injunctive relief and immediate historical review, as required under Section 43B, Paragraph 12, when a property is under legal dispute and qualifies for cultural preservation. Judge Banks leaned back. The room was silent. I'll need time to review the documents, he said at last. I'll hear further arguments tomorrow. Bang. Recess. As the courtroom emptied, Thomas Drew brushed past her. This isn't over. You're delaying the inevitable. Emily looked at him calmly. Delays are how mountains are moved, one stone at a time. Outside, the press had gathered. Reporters called out, Miss Donovan, are you really taking on Brightline alone? She didn't stop walking, but she did say, loud enough for them to hear, not alone, with my neighborhood, and with the truth. That night, Emily returned home, tired, quiet. But when she stepped onto her porch, the whole block was there. Candles were lit. Signs read, Stand with Emily. Miss Thelma from 2 doors down hugged her tight. You gave us hope again. Emily smiled, holding back tears, not because she had won yet, but because for the first time in a long time, she knew her voice still mattered. The war wasn't over, but the first shot had been fired, and it had hit its mark. The day the courtroom turned. The next morning, the skies above Savannah were gray. A soft drizzle painted the courthouse steps as Emily Donovan stood beneath her old black umbrella, binder clutched close to her chest. Inside, courtroom 5B was already packed. The media had caught wind of what happened the day before, and now reporters, students, and city officials filled every available bench. Whispers buzzed across the room. She's not a lawyer anymore, but she's winning. This is going to set a precedent. Emily walked in quietly. But this time, people noticed her. No longer invisible, and certainly no longer underestimated. Judge Banks entered briskly and took his seat. Miss Donovan, he said without preamble, I spent the night reviewing your documents. I must admit, they are thorough, shockingly so. However, this court still requires legal justification for a stay in the city's proceedings. Emotion isn't enough. Emily rose. Understood, Your Honor. If I may, I'd like to walk the court through the legal framework section by section. Drew stood instantly. Objection. We are not turning this into a law school lecture. Judge Banks waved him off. Sit down, Mr. Drew. She's earned her time. Emily opened her binder and began. Statute 43B, Paragraph 12A, specifies that if a property is linked by documented evidence to the cultural, political, or humanitarian development of historically marginalized communities, Then an injunction must be considered pending a full preservation hearing. She paused. Your Honor, yesterday I showed evidence that my great-grandmother's home was used to host civil rights leaders. Today, I submit Exhibit D, a copy of a 1965 FBI surveillance file detailing meetings in my home, noting its significance as a grassroots organizing hub during voter registration protests. Gasps echoed in the courtroom. She handed the file to the bailiff. Thomas Drew's face turned red. This is outrageous. She's digging up ancient history to stall a modern project that helps the city. Emily turned to him. That ancient history is the reason many of us even have the right to vote today. The gallery erupted into quiet applause before Judge Banks banged his gavel. Order. This is still a court of law. He looked back down at the file, now before him. Miss Donovan, where did you get this document? Emily didn't hesitate. The National Archives. Under the Freedom of Information Act. Verified by the Georgia Historical Society. Judge Banks exhaled slowly. Continue. But the courtroom wasn't done turning. Emily walked to the projection screen with a flash drive in her hand. Your Honor, with permission, I'd like to show a short clip. The judge nodded. The lights dimmed. The screen lit up with a grainy video clip from a 1982 documentary on Savannah's civil rights legacy. There on screen stood her grandmother in front of the very house they were trying to demolish. Her voice rang strong through the audio. This house kept people alive. It kept hope alive. We were poor, but we had power, because we stood together. And beside her, clear as day, a teenage Emily, holding her grandmother's hand. Judge Banks stared at the screen. Slowly, he looked back at the courtroom. Emily's voice trembled slightly now. Your Honor, it's not just about saving the house. It's about saving a piece of who we are. Thomas Drew rose again, trying to regain control. With all due respect, this is nothing but emotional manipulation. Let's return to the facts. The City Council approved this project. These homeowners signed contracts. She's the last holdout. Emily raised her head. That's not true. She turned to the back of the room, where her neighbors sat, and one by one, people began to stand. Miss Thelma, Mr. Ortiz, the Nguyen family, even quiet old Mr. Wells who hadn't spoken in years. I rescind my agreement with Brightline, Miss Thelma said firmly. So do I, said Mr. Ortiz. Us too, said the Nguyens. Judge Banks blinked. What is the meaning of this? Emily nodded. Your Honor, these contracts were signed under pressure and misinformation. Brightline's representatives misled residents, telling them there was no legal way to stop the development. I've gathered affidavits from 10 other homeowners who were told the same thing. They were told the city had already seized the properties. That was a lie. She held up the papers. Exhibit E. Thomas Drew stammered. This isn't how development works. These are business agreements. Judge Banks glared. And business agreements are void if signed under false pretenses. The silence was thick now. No more laughter. No more condescension. Emily continued, more confident than ever. I may have left the legal world, but the law never left me. I teach free legal literacy classes in my community now, because knowledge is power. She looked directly at Brightline's CEO, Mr. Langford, seated in the back. You tried to erase us, with money, with pressure, with lies, but today we speak for ourselves. Suddenly, a figure stood up from the side of the gallery, a woman in a red pantsuit. Your Honor, she called out, my name is Cynthia Harper, Executive Director of the Georgia Historical Preservation Alliance. We've been monitoring this case. Judge Banks raised an eyebrow. And we've just completed a preliminary independent review. Miss Donovan's evidence is solid. Her property qualifies under Emergency Cultural Preservation Law 4.12, which overrides local permits if cultural value is proven. Thomas Drew collapsed into his chair. The room was still. No one moved. Finally, Judge Banks spoke. This court will recess for 48 hours while we verify this claim with the Georgia Historic Board. If Miss Harper's review holds. He looked at Brightline's attorneys. Then the motion for eminent domain will be formally dismissed. He slammed the gavel. Outside, the cameras were waiting. Miss Donovan, how do you feel? What's next for you? Will this change development policy? Emily stepped to the microphone calmly. This isn't about stopping progress. It's about respecting the past before we build the future. She turned, walked down the courthouse steps, and disappeared into the crowd. Behind her, the city was watching. And for the first time, in a long time, they were listening. Justice can't be bought. The world outside Summerfield had changed, but Emily Donovan's street still stood, and for the first time in decades, it was being seen. 2 days had passed since the courtroom turned. 48 hours of headlines. Former top lawyer shocks court with historic preservation law. Simple woman defeats top development team in landmark case. The house that saved a neighborhood. Reporters were now stationed outside her street. Journalists rang her doorbell. Neighbors dropped off food. And social media lit up with hashtags like #DonovanDefense and #HistoricJustice. But Emily didn't care about fame. She cared about the final ruling, which was coming today. She stood at her grandmother's window once again, hands around her tea mug, staring out at the neighborhood she fought for. The worn bricks, the creaking porches, the chalk drawings on the sidewalks, it all felt fragile, like a candle flickering in the wind. Behind her, her binder rested on the kitchen table. Closed. Peaceful. Like a sword she no longer needed to draw. Win or lose, she whispered to the morning light, I did what I came to do. At the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Activists, students, pastors, lawyers, families, even council members from nearby districts. Inside courtroom 5B, the tension was a living thing. Judge Banks entered, expression unreadable. Emily sat alone at the defendant's table. Brightline's team had doubled in size, now with corporate lawyers flown in from New York. Thomas Drew still sat front and center, visibly sweating. Behind Emily sat 20 neighbors who had rescinded their contracts. Even Cynthia Harper of the Georgia Historical Preservation Alliance was present again, her red suit striking against the sea of somber gray. Judge Banks began. 2 days ago, this court heard compelling arguments regarding the legal and historical significance of Miss Donovan's property and others within the Summerfield neighborhood. He looked down at the papers in front of him. We requested an expedited review from the Georgia Historical Board, and we have now received a formal recommendation. A pause. Every heartbeat in the room seemed to stop. Judge Banks looked up. The board has determined that Summerfield qualifies as a site of exceptional historical importance under both State Preservation Law 43B and Emergency Cultural Preservation Law 4.12. Gasps filled the courtroom. Emily's eyes welled, but she didn't blink. She needed to hear the full decision. Accordingly, the judge continued, this court finds that the city's prior approval of Brightline's development plans violated due process by failing to consider these legal protections. He banged the gavel once, hard. I hereby order an immediate and permanent halt to all development and eminent domain proceedings in Summerfield. The neighborhood is officially protected under state historical law. The courtroom exploded. Cheers, tears, hugs. Neighbors wept into each other's shoulders. Emily closed her eyes for just one moment, letting it sink in. They weren't just saved. They were recognized. Later that afternoon, at a hastily arranged press conference, Mr. Langford, the Brightline CEO, stood at a podium with his PR team. We respect the court's decision and will seek development opportunities elsewhere, he said stiffly. Our goal has always been community progress. Emily watched the broadcast from a neighbor's living room, arms folded. Progress, she murmured, doesn't mean erasing people. That night, she received a message. It was from Judge Banks. Ms. Donovan, Your court performance was one of the most impressive I've witnessed in years. If you ever consider returning to law, my office will write you any recommendation you need." She smiled, but she didn't reply, because Emily had already found her calling. 6 months later, the Summerfield Legal Literacy Center opened inside the very house Emily had saved. The old dining room became a legal classroom. The sitting room became a consultation space, and her grandmother's study. It now held shelves of legal texts, preservation guides, and community records. The front lawn, once patchy and worn, now bloomed with donated flowers and a wooden sign. Donovan House, where knowledge lives. People came from all over, neighborhoods in Macon, Augusta, and even Birmingham, to ask for advice, to learn their rights, to fight back. And Emily, she didn't wear suits. She didn't chase promotions. She wore her gray sweater. She drank her tea. And she changed lives, one binder, one neighbor, one case at a time. One warm Saturday afternoon, a familiar voice spoke from behind her at the garden fence. "You know, we still need women like you in courtrooms." It was Rebecca Wellington, her former law firm rival, now volunteer coordinator at the center. She held 2 cups of coffee and a shy smile. Emily took one and chuckled softly. "I am in a courtroom," she said. "Every time someone walks through that door, every time they say, 'I didn't know I had rights,' we fight a trial right here." Rebecca nodded. "You ever think about going back?" Emily looked toward the street. Children on bikes, old neighbors tending their porches, the sound of gospel music in the air. "I never left." Epilogue. Brilliance in the Gray. The story of Emily Grace Donovan would soon appear in law journals, national newspapers, and civil rights documentaries. But the woman herself stayed humble. She declined interviews, refused offers from law firms, and ignored calls from television producers. Because Emily had learned something many never do. You don't need a title to be powerful. You don't need a suit to win a battle. And sometimes, being mocked for your simplicity is the greatest disguise a genius can wear. So when people pass by the Donovan house and ask, "Who lives there?" the neighbors smile and say, "Oh, just a simple woman in a gray sweater who rewrote the law."